Anders Hayden hardly looks like a radical, but he is one. Radical means root. Radical questions go to the roots of the problem. For example, are the nations of the world reacting appropriately to the dire threat of climate change? And if not, why not? Why do we have such a false understanding of wealth? And what's the nature of real wealth? Why have the benefits of technological society, which promise security and leisure for all, so completely failed to materialize? And what can we do about that? Anders Hayden is the author of When Green Growth is Not Enough: Climate Change, Ecological Modernization, and Sufficiency. Your new research is on alternative ways of measuring progress. Is that?
Yeah, that's right. So in recent years, there's been a lot of criticism of GDP as a measure of progress and well-being. And of course, it was never actually intended as a measure of progress. It was a measure originally, it was meant to be a measure of the volume of economic activity, which is not synonymous with progress or well-being. It was clearly not meant to be the case, according to Simon Kuznets, who was one of the key individuals involved in developing it. But it's come to be seen as a measure of how well we're doing as a society, how much we're advancing, and so on. And it's clearly very flawed as a measure of that kind. It doesn't take into account environmental considerations. GDP can be going up, leading to high levels of environmental destruction. It doesn't take into account inequality. So GDP in the United States has gone up quite dramatically since the early 70s. The median income hasn't gone up at all, and you see the impacts of that in the political debate today, the level of anger in the United States and the level of interest in people who are running against the establishment. But if you look at GDP alone, it looks like the country's getting better and better and better, with occasional recessions here and there, but on an upward trend. And so it's become clear that GDP is a flawed measure for a number of other reasons as well. So there have been a lot of different attempts to develop alternatives to GDP. And we've seen interest at that. It used to be that it was people on the green side of the political spectrum making these arguments, making the critique of GDP largely as a measure that doesn't take into account ecological considerations and sustainability. And you had people in green parties and environmentally minded academics and so on saying we needed alternatives to this. And more recently, we've seen that move into the mainstream, that kind of recognition of the limits of GDP. So, Nicolas Sarkozy, when he was president of France, commissioned a group led by Nobel laureates Joseph Stiglitz and Amartya Sen to look into alternatives to GDP. The OECD, or Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has been increasingly interested in alternative measurements, and it has its own Better Life Index. The European Union has a Beyond GDP initiative, or at least originally they started talking about Beyond GDP, then they changed it to GDP and Beyond, to just a slight change in the wording, but reflecting the fact that some people think this is about moving beyond GDP. Other people think of this as, well, it's still going to measure GDP, but we'll have some other measurements to go alongside it. In any case, there's been a lot of mainstream interest in this. In Britain, under David Cameron, they launched a national well-being measurement initiative with new surveys asking people in Britain how satisfied they are with their lives. So we've seen a proliferation of these initiatives around the world, and it's gotten to the point where we can now ask what impact, if any, are these alternative measurement systems having on policy and on political and social priorities. So that's what we're interested in looking at.
Now, we're right at the beginning of your research project on this, but you must have a hypothesis. What's your hypothesis about the impact of this?
Well, I don't know if I have it formulated as a clear hypothesis. I have a question about how interested in the degree to which this shift to new measurement systems the degree to which that is changing the social priorities, or the degree to which that is simply allowing some of the critique of the conventional model to be safely absorbed by dominant institutions. And I don't know what the answer to that is yet. So I mentioned earlier, it used to be the Greens, the radicals, who were critiquing GDP and saying we need alternatives. Now we have this much greater mainstream interest in it. And so the fact that you're getting this debate about how to measure progress, how to measure well-being, it opens up these possibilities to say, actually, we may have been on the wrong path. Maybe we've been prioritizing the wrong things. There are alternate opportunities here to make the case for a greater emphasis on ecological sustainability, on social equity, on considering the value of things that are not produced for a market price, the value of volunteer work, the value of all the unpaid work that goes on in households, predominantly by women, to give greater value to that in society. So there's an opportunity here for that.
Anders Hayden on the changes we need to make in ourselves and our societies to deal with the changes we're already causing in the climate. If you found this interview stimulating, you may want to see our interviews with Gwen Dyer, author of Climate Wars, and with James Lovelock, who believes we may already have irreparably damaged the intricate balance of forces that sustains our living Earth. For The Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. Come see us again.